It's time to talk about some unpopular opinions once again. Hey guys, it's Hannah, and today I'm coming to you with a video featuring all of the worst books I read in 2017. I know, it's about time for another controversial video. As always, at the end of the year, I make a video about my favorite books that I read that year, but this year I also wanted to make a video about some of my least favorite books that I've read this year. Thankfully, there weren't too many of them, but I have a total of 4 books that I read this year that I just really didn't like. Some of them I hated, some of them were just really disappointing, and others were just plain boring and bad, in my opinion. So I wanted to put them all in one video and just talk about them a bit because I don't really get to talk about them anywhere else and I kind of want to rant. I also want to preface this video by saying that these aren't all books that came out in 2017. These are just books that I read in 2017. One of them came out this year on my list, the other ones were all released in previous years, but I just read them for the first time this year. So I just wanted to make that clear because sometimes people ask. As always, I'm not going to include a disclaimer because if you are watching this video, you know that my opinions on these books are not intended to offend you, they're just my opinions on these books. So without any further ado, let's get into the 4 worst books I read in 2017. The first book on my list has to go to actually one of the very first books I read this year, and that is Ivory and Bone by Julie Eschbau. This book is marketed as a prehistoric Pride and Prejudice retelling or reimagining. Essentially, this book follows the story of these 2 rival groups or tribes, whatever you want to call them, and since it's a Pride and Prejudice retelling, you have one member from each of the groups who really don't like each other, but they have some sexual tension, so it's like Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, essentially, or at least it tries to be. But that concept in general just sounded really interesting to me. It sounded like something that I would probably enjoy because I like historical fiction, and while this is prehistoric, it's not really historical fiction. I thought it would have aspects of some like anthropological information or something in it, and it did to some degree, but it didn't do it well. At the time that I was reading this book, I was actually enrolled in an anthropology course, and the information that I was learning in my class was actually kind of relevant to the time period that I was reading about in this book, but a lot of the information didn't seem accurate to me at all, and like, I'm not saying that I am an anthropologist by any means or that I have like any sort of credibility to speak on that, but it was so explicit, like plants that existed in that time that didn't actually exist during that time, which could easily be researched. I mean, stuff like that. It just didn't really make sense, so it didn't seem like the book was that well researched to begin with. And then the other thing about this book was that it was written in the second person, which I really like second person actually. I think it's really interesting as a writing technique. I feel like it makes narratives really unique and different, but with this one, it just didn't work. I felt so disconnected from the characters. It just didn't seem like it fit at all, and it was just in there to kind of make the book quirky. It didn't really serve a purpose at all, and it just was not essential. It actually just took away from the story. And then my other problem with this was that the characters were just not interesting. Like, I didn't care about anything that happened. It didn't feel like a Pride and Prejudice retelling at all. If I didn't know from the synopsis that it was a Pride and Prejudice retelling, I never would have been able to tell from just reading the book. So yeah, overall it was just really boring and bland. I didn't feel like it was well researched. The prehistoric setting wasn't interesting in any way like I'd expected it to be, and the writing style, the second person narrative, just didn't work with the story that was being told, and overall the story itself was just completely unmemorable. I felt like as I was reading the book I was forgetting everything that was happening on the previous page. That's how much I just was not invested in this story because it didn't invite me to be so. That's why I ultimately ended up giving this book a 1.5 or 2 out of 5 stars. I don't know. I'm not 100% positive, but probably around 2 would be accurate. The next book on my list is one that I actually reread this year, and I wasn't going to include it at first, but then I realized that it's been so long since I read this book the first time, and my rating on it has changed, in fact, and I can call it one of the worst books I had to read this year. So I had to include it on the list, and that book is Divergent by Veronica Roth. If you've watched my popular books I didn't like video, I included this book in that list as well because this is one of my least favorite popular YA books, or just books in general, because I feel like it gets too much hype that it doesn't deserve. And I had to reread it this year because I took a YA class at school and it was on our syllabus. So I reread it because I hadn't read it since like the day that it had come out in 2011. I don't even remember how long ago it was. So it was about time for a reread. So I reread it and I actually realized that I hated it a lot lot more than the first time I read it. The first time I read this book, I gave it like a 3-star rating because I just thought it was okay, but this time it's definitely like 2, maybe 1.5 for me. It's just really not good in my opinion. Upon rereading this book, I realized how much I truly cannot stand Tris as a character. The thing I really don't understand about her are her motivations, because she doesn't seem to make choices for any reason other than just to progress the narrative. Like, she just doesn't seem like a real character to me. She kind of seems like a self-insert that you can just kind of like follow along and pretend like she's you, like a choose your own adventure type of thing. Also, along with that, I just don't like the overall message or moral of the story that the book is trying to portray. The thing that doesn't really make sense to me is that the message of the book is kind of about unity, about how dividing people in this way doesn't really work, about how making factions isn't really the best way to create a society, and creating separations between people isn't going to create equality. But at the same time, the book uses those concepts as metaphors for things like racism or sexism or homophobia, but it never actually addresses any of those things in the book itself. So it's not really actually a metaphor for those things, if that makes sense. I don't really know how to word this properly, but it's as if the book is trying to comment on those topics while also pretending like it's post-racial or that like sexism doesn't exist anymore. So yeah, just ultimately the basis on which the world is placed doesn't really make sense to me, so the moral of the story doesn't really come across properly in my mind. Because then there's also the whole concept of divergence, and being divergent makes you special, but then the whole message is supposed to be about equality and how anyone could be divergent, but anyone can't be divergent, so none of that really makes any sense. I'm sorry, I'm probably like reading way too far into this, but I had to analyze this for my class, so that's where this whole thought process is coming from. But yeah, just because of all of those things, because I just cannot stand Tris's character, the writing just is completely plain and boring to me, and the story itself is just very bland in my opinion. There is much better dystopian out there if you are looking for some, and if you have not read this and you're thinking about picking it up, I personally would not recommend it. The next book on my list is another one that I actually had to read for my YA class, and that is 13 Reasons Why by Jay Asher. So I actually watched the Netflix show before I read this book, and I wasn't a fan of the show either, but I have to say that I do think I ultimately like the book more than I like the show, but I still gave this one a 2 out of 5 stars. So overall, I didn't actually really like it. The thing with this book is that I felt a lot while I was reading it. It did make me very emotional, it did make me very sad, it elicited a lot of feelings from me, as the show did as well, but I didn't like the way that this book discussed the topic it was trying to handle. Suicide is something that is very difficult to discuss, but it's also something that needs to be discussed. So the one thing I do appreciate about this book is that it starts conversations, but my problem with it is the way in which it decides to do so. So much of this book was just blaming the other people in the story for Hannah's suicide, and it was framed in a way as if Hannah was committing suicide as an act of revenge, which I just don't like that idea at all. The show actually does a better job of making the other characters seem more human and taking the blame off of them a bit, but then the show has its own other individual problems, which is a whole nother story that I'm not going to get into in this video because we're just going to talk about the book. But in terms of the book, all you get is Hannah's perspective and Clay's perspective. And in terms of Hannah's perspective, I actually liked those parts, but I didn't really like Clay's perspective in this book because to me it just felt so unnecessary. Even though Hannah's suicide seemed like a revenge suicide, even though she seemed really biased, and people a lot of the time criticize her by saying that she was just really annoying and that a lot of this is her fault and all of this other terrible negative stuff, which is completely untrue, and I don't think any of that at all. For me personally, I could actually sympathize with Hannah at times because what I liked about this book was that you got to be inside of her mind, and even if for her all of these things felt like they were the things that were contributing to her suicide, even if she was blaming these people for her suicide, that's just what was going on in her head. I just didn't like the parts with Clay because they seemed so irrelevant to me because I felt like it should have been her story and not his story. The other thing about this that I didn't like is that this book doesn't address mental illness almost at all. Hannah is clearly suffering from depression, and they never really have a discussion on that. They never really talk about support for that or how you can get help for that. And there's just no conversation about mental health. The book kind of just focuses on bullying, and I feel like if it was a story that was trying to make a commentary on bullying, it could have done so in a different way rather than focusing on the story of a depressed girl who committed suicide. So those are just some of my brief thoughts on this book. I have a lot of other feelings about it as well, but ultimately I did enjoy aspects of the story, but overall I just did not like the way that it framed the message that it was trying to send. And lastly on my list of worst books I read this year is one that I was actually really excited to read read. I was highly anticipating this book and I thought I was gonna love it, but ultimately I just really did not like it. And that book is An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. This is a book that was released this year and I was so excited to read it, like I said, because the synopsis sounded really interesting to me, the cover was really beautiful, and it just sounded like something I was going to enjoy. This book is a fantasy novel that takes place in this world where fae or fairies exist, and this girl, the main character, is an artist who paints portraits, and she paints portraits for a lot of the fae. And then one day, this fae named the Autumn Prince asks her to paint his portrait for her, and then the two begin to develop a romance, and ultimately, this book was just too short and it didn't have enough plot or build up. And apart from the writing, it just really didn't have anything going for it. It was just completely lacking. Like I said, the one thing that this book did have going for it was the writing. It is well written, it does have a few beautiful lines here and there, but ultimately that doesn't really make up for the lack of plot. This book is really short. It's only about like 300 pages, and nothing really happens within those 300 pages except for these two characters falling in love way too quickly. When the Autumn Prince comes into town and our main character is supposed to paint his portrait, it takes about like 3 pages for them to cover about like a few months, I think, of her trying to paint his portrait. So we don't even get to see the beginning of their relationship develop at all. I don't remember if it's a few months or a few weeks, but essentially like the beginning of the two of them meeting. Aside from their first initial meeting, we don't really get to see their interactions when they first meet. So there's no build up to their romance whatsoever. And then as the story progresses, they just fall in love so quickly. Like she falls into his arms and suddenly she's in love with him. And it's very cliche and there's just nothing special about it. It wasn't even like angsty to the point where it was kind of bad, but you could enjoy the angsty romance. That wasn't even in here. There was just nothing at all. And I can't even say it was just because I was expecting something from this book. It honestly just is not good. Even if I wasn't expecting anything from it, it just doesn't have enough substance for it to be an enjoyable book for me. So yeah, I was just so disappointed in this book because I really thought that I was going to love it, but ultimately it offered nothing for me and it just fell so flat. And while I did enjoy the writing, it didn't make up for the lack of everything else that I wanted from this book. Alright, so that is it for my list of worst books I read in 2017. I hope you all enjoyed watching this video. Like I said at the beginning, obviously none of my opinions are meant to offend anybody who's watching this. If one of these books was your favorite book that you read this year, I'm really happy for you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I wish I could have enjoyed it too, but I did not. Let me know in the comments down below, what are some of your least favorite books that you read in 2017? Did you also read any of these books? Did you like them? Did you dislike them? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you'd like to follow me on any of my social media, all of my links are in the description box as always. But thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!